All right, there are definitely a lot of opinions out there when it comes to what Apple is doing right now as we're heading into the last quarter of 2020, but I really want to revisit the iPhone SE 2, and is this still the device to beat, regardless of what is on the horizon, regardless of what has been recently launched? And this is actually coming from an Android user. Let's get into it. What is going on, you beautiful humans? Welcome back to the channel, and today I want to follow up with a community on a couple of videos that I have posted on the iPhone SE 2. I will link all of those up here, over here, and of course down below. Now, what I actually want to address is really the value proposition when it comes to the iPhone SE 2, what Apple's actually doing to change the game here, and really, is this going to still be able to compete as Apple is launching the iPhone 12 here very shortly. Now, looking at it from a strictly budgetary standpoint and just getting into the ecosystem of Apple, looking at the iPhone SE 2 with that entry point of $399, I still think that it is a fantastic way to actually get into the ecosystem. Now, many of you might have seen videos on here and you know that I am a macOS user through and through, but I have never owned an iPhone up until the SE 2. I have been Android from the beginning, from the get, and so I can appreciate both ecosystems. Now, let me briefly mention with the iPhone 12, at least the rumored specs here, we are actually looking, apparently, per what we are seeing on Twitter and the ethos out there, as far as some of the individuals leaking information, is that there are going to be at least 3 iterations of the new iPhone 12. And one of those iterations is going to be very close as far as close in size to the SE 2, but with a caveat here, because there is going to be an iPhone 12 that is a 5.4-inch display. However, it's going to be smaller than the SE 2, which is a 4.7-inch display. And of course, a 4.7-inch display may be a con for many of you out there, but for me, I honestly really appreciate being able to hold this phone in one hand and actually do a few things with it and have my thumb reach across the screen. It sounds like a really weird and kind of silly like pro or something that I really enjoy, but for the most part, when it comes to some of these phones, and like I said, I've been an Android user for years, those phones can get quite massive, and for you to actually do some of those things with one hand, it can be a little cumbersome. Now, of course, one of the reasons that this iPhone 12 that is a 5.4-inch display, that's because it's edge to edge, whereas with the SE 2, yeah, you're not getting edge to edge, but does that really bother me? Actually, not at all. Now, moving over to this iPhone 12 with the 5.4-inch display, which they're actually calling the iPhone mini, which I guess I can understand from a marketing standpoint. If they're going to keep the SE 2 around and there could be some confusion on the part of the consumer about the size, then the fact that the SE 2 is a little bit bigger, but a smaller display technically. And so I know that they kind of have to come up with some name for it. And of course, mini is, of course, attributed or at least aligned with the Mac Mini. So it's definitely something they've used. I think it's kind of silly, but regardless, they actually have to differentiate here. But the iPhone 12 mini coming in at $699, at least the rumors, and that will likely only be a 64 gig device. Now the SE 2 at $399, still $300 cheaper, is again 64 gigabytes. But to double that storage, it's just another $50. Now, will Apple actually double that storage for another $50 with the iPhone 12 mini? It's possible, but you're still looking at a $300 jump. And of course, I do have to admit that the A14 chipset that is supposed to be in the iPhone 12, it's very intriguing, because these Apple chipsets are something else. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But let's actually pivot back to the $300. That extra $300 could get you the newly released Apple Watch SE for $279. So here we are looking at, from a price point here, looking at like all in, if you want to be into the ecosystem and you get an SE2, you add an Apple Watch SE for $279, And then you even add the newly released iPad for around $329. You are entirely into this ecosystem without actually having a Mac computer, but being able to do a lot for around $1,000. Man, that's pretty insane. Now let's actually talk a little bit about the A13 chipset versus the A14 chipset. And this is not going to be very technical, but what we can probably assume based on what we're seeing in iPad specs, what they're actually talking about with the silicon that's going to be added into the MacBooks and even like all Mac computers here in the next couple of years, what we can deduce from some simple math based on some graphs that have been floating around is that we'll likely see a 20% increase in being able to be more productive, faster, and more efficient than the A13 chipset. And of course, that's based on some speculation. But what I can actually tell you as far as the A13 chipset that is in this phone, this thing is capable of not only podcasting, you can literally record a podcast and edit a podcast. And you're like, okay, yeah, I kind of knew that. And of course, I can link up a video on how to actually do that with better audio quality and a very minimal editing breakdown. However, what I've actually been finding is being able to edit 4K 422 footage coming out of the camera that I am talking to you right now. I can literally bring that footage into this device and edit it on that monitor right behind me. And here's the thing, 4K footage I'm editing and it doesn't hesitate. I can scrub through the timeline, I can play the 4K footage, no problem. I'm a little bit limited using LumaFusion, which I'll actually do a video on because right now I'm editing some videos in LumaFusion just to try to get familiar with it. And it still offers a lot, but it's not a full editing suite like Final Cut Pro or Premiere or DaVinci Resolve. But going back to some of you who may be filming with these devices and needing to edit, but you don't have a good PC or you don't have a Mac computer, it is possible to do this. Now let's actually talk a few of the pros that I think of this device. And again, I talked about the size. I honestly think that the size is perfect, just for me. Now, of course, one of the things that I really think is pretty awesome is the Touch ID. Being able to just do the thumbprint, fingerprint, and especially in the days of where we're wearing masks, and I know plenty of creators have talked about that, and I actually feel like Touch ID is going to come back to iPhone 12, but on the side, so the power button, just like they did on the iPad Air. And of course, the fact that the camera can film at 4K 60 frames per second. I mean, even my camera that I am talking to you in right now can film in 4K, but not at 60 frames per second. Now let's actually keep our expectations in line here. Of course, you do get a 12 megapixel camera on the rear and 7 megapixel on the front. But when we talk about the 4K footage and when we actually talk about the camera, this thing takes some phenomenal shots and it actually gets some great video. But most of this is actually done in the software. Yes, the hardware is really nice, and of course the chipset really helps push that along. But again, keep that in mind. When you're using a mobile device, a lot is happening in the software. And Apple has really kind of dialed this in, although Android is also doing a phenomenal job as well. And of course, one of the videos that I did where using the iPhone SE2 as a camera, even for talking head, I do use a customized third-party app from Moment. I will certainly link that below. I highly recommend that because that'll allow you to get more manual functions and more access to the features of the camera that's not really available in the native camera app. And of course, I talked about vlogging and using it as like one of your go-to cameras because honestly, I mean, this thing is so small. I mean, it's in your pocket, ready to roll. And if you want to vlog, you want to film something, you have it. It's the camera that can be your primary. Whereas I don't always carry my Sony cameras with me, but I always have my phone. And of course, one thing to think about if you are considering accessorizing your iPhone, I know we're trying to stay on budget here. However, if you want to get away from the camera and use this as your primary camera, like this is something that you have with you all of the time, you might want to consider something like the wireless mic system like the ones I'm reviewing here from Comica. It gives me that good audio. I'm about 20 feet away from the iPhone. And again, if you're using it as your primary filmmaking device or even a secondary and you want to get some behind the scenes, establishing shots, whatever that may be, and you want to get that good audio, it's just really something to consider. One of the things that I also want to pivot over to, especially like when you're out and about, and maybe a con. Why don't we actually talk about a con? People ask about the battery life. So I've actually used this phone off and on, and sometimes I will use it for days on end or maybe even weeks. I'll pop my SIM card in and just use this exclusively. Now I realize that for the most part, a lot of us are working from home. But when it comes to actually using it for moderate usage, and that would be answering comments on YouTube, maybe watching a few YouTube videos, streaming some podcasts, answering some emails, doing any kind of streaming or some things that I, again, would consider moderate. Not, of course, getting in there and editing a 4K timeline like unplugged and being able to get all day usage, but just moderate usage. And I'm getting all day battery life, and all day meaning around 8 hours, give or take. But here's the thing, most of us are actually working at home or at least near a plug. So if battery life is going to be an issue for you, if you are someone who is a road warrior at this point, or you are out and about and you're not going to be near a power source, the SE2, it may be questionable about whether this is the phone for you. Especially coming from Android devices, where I've had Android devices I've literally used like all day, left it unplugged and then woke up in the morning and still had battery available. Yeah, I mean, it is a little bit hard to come from that. But again, this has not actually been an obstacle for me just yet. Now, when it comes to support, I've typically gotten support from the OnePlus devices, give or take 2 or 3 years, 3 years, kind of stretching it with the Android updates. However, with the iOS 14, the recent release on that, which I'll touch on that just briefly, which I think is kind of funny, is that it's supported. I mean, the 6S is still supported with iOS 14. So the SE2, I think, is going to be supported for years to come. So I wouldn't even worry about that at all. But the funny thing is with the iOS 14 and the ability to add widgets and some customization, I mean, Android users out there, we might laugh at that a little bit because we've been doing that for years. But here's the thing, you know what? Apple is great at marketing, great at sales, and great at just kind of feeling things out about what customers want. So yep, they're kind of new on the block when it comes to this customization, but here's the thing. All of these other third-party apps now are starting to develop widgets and customization for iOS users. I mean, Apple, they're just on it. And so people know that iOS users, like, they get excited about this stuff. And so they get on it, do their R&D, and they figure out how to develop these widgets. And so I think as iOS 14 continues to be developed, we're going to start seeing more ability to customize, and it's just going to be the case. It's the same thing with Apple Pay. Another little thing that Android users, we can kind of like snicker at a little bit, in that we were using Android Pay, Google Pay years before Apple Pay, of course, came on the scene, although you could barely find anybody who used it, but it was there for quite some time, well before Apple. Now, I think I've probably exhausted it enough. I really wanted this to be a bit quicker than it probably will end up being. What questions can I help you with? What kind of conversations can we have below? As always, you know I'm around YouTube. I'm down in the comments section, so hit me up. And if you don't hit me up there, then hit me up on Twitter, because I'm also on Twitter quite a bit. Stay tuned for more iPhone content here, specifically the SE2, with podcasting, audio work, and of course, video editing, which I'm in the middle of right now. And go out there and do those things that matter. Keep rocking the faces. I really appreciate your time and attention on this one. Go out there, do the things. I'm going to keep creating here, and I'll catch you right back here on the next one.